think it's important to say that where the powers that be, however you want to define that, are taking people is essentially leading us to some sort of two-tier society where there is really no need for a middle class, and it's really more accurately described as like a neo-feudal style society where you have a large underclass managed by sort of this more elite group that would do the managing. And I think it really falls under what some people have referred to as technocracy, sort of this idea of more of like a scientific dictatorship. And there's actually this prominent figure from the Club of Rome named Dennis Meadows, and the Club of Rome is an entity that has a very intertwined history with groups that have become infamous over the past several years, like the World Economic Forum, for example. But Dennis Meadows essentially said something to the effect that, for the good of people and the planet and the economy, and in his words, that it was going to be necessary to either reduce the world's population so that people could have freedom and use resources the way they want, or that there would have to be a scientific dictatorship imposed on 8 billion or 7 billion people in order to ensure accurate allocation of resources and all of this stuff by an educated, technocratic, scientific elite. And there are some thinkers in Silicon Valley, like Eric Schmidt, for example, who wrote a book on AI with Henry Kissinger, that essentially say that there's going to be this sort of future brought to us by AI, where there will be the class of people that understand how AI works, that program and maintain it. And then there will be this underclass, people who AI acts upon, who can't understand what AI is doing to them. And eventually, because of their dependence on AI, will become cognitively diminished and mentally unable, essentially, to make decisions for themselves without AI's help. And there's a lot of other indications, I would argue, whether it's UBI, which again is going to be for I don't think, the top oligarchs in Silicon Valley, like Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, are going to be receiving UBI. I think it's intended to be for other people that aren't necessarily in that economic tier. I think it's very likely you're going to see, if these people succeed in their designs, really more of a two-tier society without any sort of need for a middle class. It's been happening, and I think, as to why they might be playing with fire, it's much easier to manipulate people now than perhaps in times past. For example, there was a 2014 research study that was funded by the US Air Force that was about studying how to use social media to control people like drones, which I think is a very disturbing research proposal in and of itself. Basically, this idea that you could use social media networks by tailoring what information people see and don't see down to the individual based on data mined about them off of the internet and then analyzed by various algorithms to basically, essentially mind control people and, in the words, I guess, of that Air Force proposal. And, other militaries around the world have spent millions upon millions of dollars over the past decade plus researching how to manipulate people on social media platforms. So I think it's very possible that they think they can manage it, since a lot of, discourse has become increasingly online, and that, they can really alter how people perceive reality to unprecedented degrees. And another thing that's brought up in this book by Schmidt and Kissinger talks about, eventually people won't be able to know what's real and what's not. Things like AI deepfakes and things like that. But, what if these deepfakes are wielded by the state to manipulate people? And what if we're led to believe that things happened when they didn't happen? A lot of the fear mongering about deepfakes is when it's in the hands of an alleged cyber criminal or someone like that. But, there's states around the world that have an arsenal of these digital weapons that are meant to manipulate us in our perception of reality and what's real. And if you can use AI or other means to control how people perceive reality, you can control their behavior. It's kind of dangerous for a lot of us to outsource our creative ability to AI, have AI create for us, because essentially when you're not performing those activities yourselves, it sort of falls under, if you don't use it, you lose it paradigm. So like a lot of us don't really do mental math anymore because most people have a calculator in their smartphone, for example. And so, you don't use that ability, eventually you lose it. So what happens if AI becomes, the main generator of creative content and people forget how to make art because they haven't done it in so long and things like that? I personally tend to fall into more sort of the analog future to a purely digital future, but I think there's a way to do it where we don't really have this situation where the AI algorithm is running our lives and we don't have any agency anymore. I think that's very dangerous. And I think also there's been a lot of hype about AI and its ability to reach that sort of godlike intellect level. I think it's very possible that you could have that essentially faked by some entity and they could claim that, which has happened in the past. past. You had a Google engineer, perhaps ex-Google engineer a few years ago, attempt to say that a chatbot that he was working with was sentient, and it was not. So there's the possibility that someone could come out with that story, and if it was widely adopted and enough people said it was, it could be believed to be so, and wouldn't it actually be that? And in that type of scenario, I think that's dangerous because it sort of gives this Wizard of Oz functionality, for example, to the government. We made this policy, you hate it, but the computer said so, so that's why we did it. You know, it's the computer's fault, it's not our fault. It's a way to sort of offshore responsibility onto the algorithm and away from the people at the top. But I'm not trying to say like eliminate AI and don't use it. I personally am not into it, but I have a lot of friends that are. And so I'm not trying to be like that negative about it in that sense. But I also think this whole idea that we should surrender ourselves to the algorithm because it's so much more intelligent than us, which is sort of implicit in that Eric Schmidt Kissinger book. I definitely don't agree with that at all, because I think humans should not surrender their agency. And I think it's sort of in that scenario I sort of just laid out, if it's overhyped and it's claimed that it reached that, you know, people could surrender their agency to something that isn't actually possessing this godlike super intelligence, but have just been told it is. And I think that potentially could be very dangerous. I think debt is a very real and serious issue, and the amount of debt the U.S. government has accrued, I think, is a testament to the poor fiscal management of the U.S. government, and not just the executive branch, but Congress as well. And it's been going on for a very, very long time, and not a lot has been done about it. And really, you know, in the post 9/11 era, the amount of debt that, you know, the U.S. government has taken on has just absolutely ballooned when you compare it to previous decades. And I think a lot of that has to do with the foreign wars that the U.S. government has engaged in, including ones that aren't formally declared, in this sort of effort to expand the military empire abroad and sort of maintain that hegemony and dominance. And historically, a lot of that was also directly related to dollar hegemony, the petrodollar system, which now we know has essentially been on the way out. But a colleague of mine, Mark Goodwin, put out a book a few years ago about this idea of the Bitcoin dollar system, and this idea that the US government would sort of use Bitcoin and create the system that's like an analog to the petrodollar system. Because when Bitcoin is purchased, usually it's done with, you know, by buying dollars first in order to purchase Bitcoin, for example. And in that type of situation, you'd be just like in the case of, you know, the petrodollar, where price of oil is priced in dollars. You're generating artificial demand for dollars to buy some sort of energy commodity or energy asset. And Bitcoin sort of is an energy asset at the end of the day. It's moving, essentially attempting to create the same system, but instead of with oil, with Bitcoin. And most of the Bitcoin holdings in the world are concentrated in the United States, and the US government itself is one of the biggest holders of Bitcoin in the world. So I think there's sort of this effort there to do that. And this was actually implicit in Trump's speech that he gave at the Bitcoin conference a few months ago, sort of saying that's what he sort of saw utility in Bitcoin for, in a sense. But I think also that causes a lot of complications when it relates to the ethos of Bitcoin, which was originally about stopping irresponsible central bank policy and fiscal policy. The idea that you would yoke Bitcoin to the US dollar instead of using it to challenge the US dollar or challenge fiat or challenge debt-based currency or a debt-based monetary system. Obviously, if you join, you know, the US dollar to Bitcoin, having Bitcoin be a challenge to those things essentially kind of has to stop. And really in that situation, you could have Bitcoin enable that type of irresponsible fiscal policy, because you would essentially be using it as a sink for hyperinflation at the end of the day. So essentially, if you were to like hyperinflate the dollar in this type of system, obviously the price of Bitcoin would appreciate as price in US dollars, but Bitcoin itself isn't subject to inflation. So the people that hold Bitcoin in that case would really benefit in that type of scenario, but people that hold, you know, dollars, for example, would not necessarily. But there's also this effort to sort of resolve that aspect of it by bringing stable coins into the equation, which are digital dollars, but they're kind of gobbling up US treasuries, and, you know, are buying sort of like nation state level amount of US government debt and servicing the debt at the same time. So sort of the Bitcoin dollar system, as I understand it. And again, this is Mark Goodwin's work, and he can probably explain it a lot better than me and the detailed mechanisms and all of that. But as I understand it, you would have to have sort of these dollar stable coins in the mix as well, as a way to sort of absorb government debt. And even, you know, these things may not be enough to absorb all of the debt that we have. And so there's these efforts right now, this idea of real world asset tokenization, there's this push into tokenizing what is referred to as natural capital or aspects to major, like even entire ecosystems essentially, and tokenizing them and using that as sort of like a store of wealth of finite supply. So there's this one effort, for example, that's seeking to tokenize each hectare of the Amazon rainforest. And there's 750 million hectares. So there's a finite supply of this digital asset security that's tied to each hectare of the rainforest. So then you have something else that could, in theory, be used as a sink for this stuff too, because when it's of a finite supply, it's not subject to inflation. And so you can sort of mitigate the impacts of inflation by having this anti-inflationary thing because of its finite supply as a sink, for the thing that you're creating more of in the case of dollars. But the side part of this is that in order to ensure the integrity of the hectare on which each unit of token is based, you must surveil the forest. And so there's this whole idea of now creating the Internet of Forests, putting sensors on every tree and every hectare of the Amazon in order to ensure that no one's messing with it. And this may also at some point include, the indigenous people that live there, because if one hectare has an indigenous tribe and less trees, right, as compared to another hectare that isn't inhabited, which one is more valuable in the eyes of investors, particularly if there's this effort to impose like a carbon market, a global carbon market, which some people like Mark Carney and other prominent, central bankers and other bankers have discussed as an alleged solution, to environmental issues in the world. The idea is to also use satellite surveillance. And so this particular effort to tokenize the Amazon specifically is teamed up with a satellite company called Satellogic. And Satellogic, the chair of the board is Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary. And also on the board is a man named Howard Lutnick, who was recently named to be co-chair of Trump's transition team. And he's the longtime head of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is one of the main dealers of U.S. Treasuries, and also very intimately connected to the stablecoin Tether, which is also invested in Satellogic. It'll be interesting to see exactly what goes on there as it relates to the satellite firm, which is also, in previous reporting I did with Mark Goodwin, who I mentioned earlier for Bitcoin Magazine, they've been involved in sort of this effort to create a carbon market in Latin America that was built on the Bitcoin blockchain specifically, which is something that I think a lot of, at least older school Bitcoiners who are not really into the idea of carbon markets or any of these things would be, quite against, but also are, vying for U.S. intelligence and military contracts. And the people that created that company are longtime contractors for DARPA and the NSA and U.S. intelligence. So you're going to have this satellite firm, surveilling large swaths of Latin America. If these efforts, one of which is called Green Plus and the other one called One Amazon, go through, you'll essentially have a company that's tied to, for important people that are, as it relates to the U.S. government, former officials, also people that have historically been U.S. government and intelligence contractors. And also Tether is behaving rather, making some interesting choices for a stablecoin issuer, I think, as well. They've started investing, for example, in brain-machine interfaces, brain chips and that sort of thing, and have also, onboarded the FBI and Secret Service onto their platform and have been, shutting down people's wallets on behalf of the Treasury's OFAC and entities like that. I think some of these stablecoin issuers, the prominent ones anyway, are sort of anticipating this kind of system and are sort of embedding themselves with powerful actors that I think ultimately mitigate their ability to be what some people have argued are human rights tools. Some people have said that about stablecoins in the past. But if you're onboarding, one particular government, which very much has a political agenda as it relates to Latin America and other parts of the world, onto your stablecoin and are freezing, and taking people's money essentially at the behest of that government, and also getting, invested with people that are, at least in the case of a future Trump administration, are likely to have some political connections there as well. I think that's pretty significant.